The cigarette smoke hung thick in Murphy's tavern like a fog of bad decisions. 12 leather-clad bikers surrounded the lone woman at the corner table, their laughter growing louder and more aggressive with each passing minute. She sat perfectly still, nursing her whiskey, her dark hair falling across her face like a curtain. What they saw was easy prey. What they didn't see was the storm they were about to unleash. "Hey, sweetheart," growled Tank Morrison, the gang leader whose beer gut strained against his leather vest. "This ain't no place for little girls playing dress-up." She didn't look up, didn't even flinch, just took another slow sip of her drink. That's when Tank made the biggest mistake of his miserable life. From which city in the world are you watching this story today? If you enjoyed this tale of underestimated strength and unexpected revelations, consider subscribing for more stories that prove appearances can be deadly deceiving. The fluorescent lights of Murphy's Tavern cast harsh shadows across weather-beaten faces and revealed secrets some would prefer to keep hidden. Located on the outskirts of Fort Bragg, the bar served as neutral ground for a peculiar mix of clientele. Discharged veterans drowning their memories, active-duty soldiers seeking escape from base life, and the occasional biker gang rolling through on their way to somewhere that mattered less than where they'd been. Sarah Blackwood chose her seat deliberately. Corner table, back to the wall, clear sight lines to both exits. Old habits from a life most people wouldn't believe if she told them. But there were signs if you knew what to look for. The way her eyes swept the room in calculated patterns, the way her hands remained visible and relaxed yet somehow ready, the way she positioned herself like someone who had learned through hard experience that survival meant controlling your environment before it controlled you. But Tank Morrison's Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club wasn't known for their observational skills. The whiskey in front of her remained largely untouched, more prop than comfort. She'd learned long ago that alcohol and vigilance didn't mix, and despite appearances, she was very much on duty tonight. Though what kind of duty, and for whom, remained a mystery that would unfold in ways none of these men could possibly imagine. Her civilian clothes told a carefully constructed story. Worn jeans, faded black t-shirt, scuffed boots that had seen better years. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed money or importance. Just another working-class woman trying to disappear into the background noise of American life. The disguise was perfect, refined through years of practice in places where the wrong kind of attention could mean the difference between mission success and body bags. But Tank Morrison's Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club wasn't known for their observational skills. The 12 bikers had rolled in an hour earlier, their Harley-Davidsons rumbling like mechanical thunder as they claimed the parking lot. Tank Morrison led them, a mountain of a man whose reputation preceded him through 3 states. Assault charges, drug trafficking, extortion, his rap sheet read like a criminal's greatest hits album. Behind him followed his loyal pack, Viper Jackson with his trademark snake tattoos, Diesel Murphy, whose hands were permanently stained with motor oil and blood, and 9 others whose names mattered less than their willingness to follow Tank into whatever violence the night might bring. They'd been drinking steadily, their voices growing louder as inhibitions dissolved in cheap beer and cheaper whiskey. The conversation inevitably turned to their favourite topics: territory disputes with rival gangs, women they'd conquered, and laws they'd broken without consequence. What they didn't know was that their every word was being catalogued by someone whose job it was to collect intelligence on threats to national security. Because the Iron Wolves weren't just any biker gang. And Sarah wasn't just any woman sitting alone in a bar, but those revelations would come later, much later, after the blood dried and the sirens faded and the truth emerged in ways that would change everything about how this story ended. "Cops in this town are soft," Viper was saying, his voice carrying the particular arrogance of a man who'd never faced real consequences. "Badge don't mean nothing when you're outnumbered 12-1. Diesel nodded agreement, crushing his empty beer can with one meaty fist. "Military boys ain't much better. All that training, all that gear, but they still bleed like everybody else." Old Murphy behind the bar said nothing, just continued polishing glasses with hands that trembled slightly. He'd owned this establishment for 43 years, serving everyone from fresh-faced recruits to battle-hardened veterans. He'd learned when to listen and when to pretend he heard nothing at all. Tank's attention drifted to the corner table where Sarah sat alone. Well, he said, loud enough for his crew to hear. Looks like we got ourselves some entertainment for the evening. The pack turned as one, following their leader's gaze. What they saw confirmed their worst assumptions about women who drank alone in bars that catered to dangerous men. Easy target, vulnerable, isolated. They were wrong on every count. But they wouldn't discover just how wrong until it was far too late to matter. Tank rose from his bar stool with the swagger of a man accustomed to intimidating everyone he encountered. His boots hit the floor with deliberate heavy steps as he approached Sarah's table, his gang falling in behind him like wolves scenting wounded prey. The formation was practiced, efficient, designed to corner and overwhelm. They'd done this before, in other bars, to other women who'd made the mistake of being alone and vulnerable. Only Sarah wasn't vulnerable. She was something else entirely, something that would become terrifyingly clear in the next few minutes. "Evening, darling," Tank said, his voice carrying the false politeness that preceded violence. "Mighty lonely sitting over here by yourself." Sarah's eyes remained fixed on her whiskey glass. She'd been tracking their movement from the moment they entered, cataloguing threats, assessing capabilities, calculating responses. 12 men, various levels of intoxication, standard biker gang hierarchy with clear leadership structure. Nothing she hadn't handled before, though usually under different circumstances. In places where the enemy wore different uniforms and spoke different languages. In situations where the rules of engagement were written in classified manuals that civilians would never see. But the fundamentals remained the same. Assess, adapt, neutralize. Though tonight's mission parameters were unique. "Name's Tank Morrison," he continued, interpreting her silence as fear rather than assessment. "Maybe you heard of me." Still no response. Sarah rotated her glass slowly, the amber liquid catching the light. Every second of silence was deliberate, calculated to build tension and encourage Tank to overcommit to his chosen course of action. A technique learned in interrogation training, refined through years of field application. But these weren't enemy combatants in a war zone. These were American citizens in an American bar. The rules were different here, more complicated, more dangerous in their own way. Viper stepped closer, emboldened by Tank's apparent control of the situation. "Boss is talking to you, sweetheart. Might want to show some manners." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, though only old Murphy behind the bar seemed to notice. His weathered hands moved more deliberately as he cleaned glasses, and his eyes kept darting toward the phone mounted on the wall behind the cash register. 43 years of running this establishment had given him an instinct for when situations were about to spiral beyond control. And something about the woman in the corner told him that tonight was going to be different from anything he'd ever witnessed. Sarah finally looked up, meeting Tank's gaze with eyes that held no fear, no intimidation, only a calm assessment that seemed to see right through him. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly across the suddenly silent bar. "I'm not interested in company tonight." The words were simple, direct, final. But the way she said them suggested that refusing her preference would have consequences far beyond what anyone in the room could imagine. Tank's face reddened at what he perceived as dismissal. In his world, women didn't refuse Tank Morrison. They smiled and played along, or they learned painful lessons about the consequences of disrespect. What he didn't understand was that he'd just encountered someone for whom his world's rules simply didn't apply. "See, that's where you got it wrong, sweetheart," he said, his voice hardening. "You don't get to decide what kind of company you keep in here. This is our place now." Sarah took another slow sip of whiskey, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "I'll keep that in mind." But what happened next would shatter Tank Morrison's understanding of power, violence, and what it meant to encounter someone who operated on a completely different level than anything he'd ever imagined. The dismissal hung in the air like a challenge. Around the bar, conversations stopped as other patrons sensed the brewing confrontation. A few smart ones quietly settled their tabs and headed for the door, unwilling to get caught in whatever was about to unfold. Their instincts were correct, though they couldn't possibly have anticipated just how dramatically the evening was about to change. Diesel cracked his knuckles loudly. Maybe she needs a hearing aid, Tank. Doesn't seem to understand simple conversation. Or maybe, Tank said, reaching down to grab the back of Sarah's chair, she needs a lesson in respect. That's when everything changed, but not in the way anyone expected, because what Tank Morrison and his Iron Wolves were about to discover was that some lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. And some women carry secrets that can redefine everything you thought you knew about strength, training, and what happens when you threaten the wrong person on the wrong night. Sarah's hand moved so fast it seemed to blur. One moment Tank was reaching for her chair, the next he was on his knees, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that threatened to snap bone. The speed and precision of the movement left everyone in the bar stunned into silence. The technique was called a Kimura takedown, perfected in dojos and refined in combat zones where hesitation meant death. But the bikers didn't know its name. They only knew that their invincible leader had been reduced to a whimpering, controlled figure in less time than it took to blink. "I said I wasn't interested," she repeated, her voice still calm, but now carrying an undertone that raised the hair on everyone's neck. Tank tried to struggle, his face contorting with pain and rage. "You crazy bit!" His words cut off as Sarah applied just enough additional pressure to remind him how easily she could end this confrontation permanently. The leverage was perfect, the control absolute. One more degree of rotation, and Tank Morrison's arm would break in 3 places. In the sudden silence that followed, old Murphy could hear his own heart beating. In 43 years of running this establishment, he'd never seen anything like it. The control was surgical, professional, almost artistic in its efficiency. But he had no idea what he was really witnessing. None of them did. Not yet. The Iron Wolves stood frozen, uncertain how to respond. Their leader, their invincible Tank Morrison, was being dominated by someone they'd written off as an easy victim. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to process. Viper was the first to recover, his hand moving toward the knife on his belt. "Let him go, or what?" Sarah asked, her eyes meeting his with a directness that stopped him cold. "You'll make this worse for everyone involved?" Something in her tone suggested she wasn't just referring to Tank's current predicament. There was knowledge there, experience, a familiarity with violence that went far beyond barroom brawls. The kind of knowledge that came from places where violence wasn't recreational, it was professional. But the Iron Wolves were about to learn that there were different kinds of professionals in the world, and some of them looked nothing like what you'd expect. Old Murphy had gone pale behind the bar, his shaking hands abandoning all pretense of cleaning glasses. In 43 years of running this establishment, he'd seen plenty of fights, but nothing like this. The woman's control was absolute, professional, almost surgical in its precision. "Please," he called out, his voice cracking slightly. "Let's all just calm down here. No need for anybody to get hurt." Sarah glanced toward the bartender, and for just a moment her expression softened slightly. "No one has to get hurt, Mr. Murphy. That's entirely up to these gentlemen." Her use of his name stopped him cold. He hadn't introduced himself. His name wasn't on any visible signage. So how did she know who he was? Unless she'd done her homework before coming here tonight. Unless this wasn't the random encounter it appeared to be. Tank's face was turning red, whether from pain, humiliation, or lack of proper circulation was unclear. "When I get up from here," he gasped, "you're going to regret ever being born." Sarah's grip shifted slightly, and Tank's threat dissolved into a sharp intake of breath. "When you get up from here," she said quietly, "you're going to walk out that door and never come back, and you're going to tell your friends to do the same." The standoff stretched for long seconds, tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. The other Iron Wolves shifted nervously, hands hovering near weapons, but uncertain whether drawing them would improve or catastrophically worsen their situation. That's when Diesel made his move. The big man lunged forward, apparently convinced that overwhelming force could tip the balance back in their favor. It was a reasonable assumption under normal circumstances. Diesel outweighed Sarah by more than £100 and had spent years in bar fights and prison yards learning how to hurt people efficiently. He never got the chance to apply those lessons. What happened next would be replayed in the memories of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Because they were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about combat, about training, and about what a single person could accomplish when pushed to their limits. But more than that, they were about to discover that the quiet woman in the corner carried secrets that went far beyond impressive fighting skills. Secrets that would explain not just how she could do what she was about to do, but why she was here in the first place. Because this wasn't a random encounter. And Sarah Blackwood wasn't just passing through town. The big man lunged forward, apparently convinced that overwhelming force could tip the balance back in their favour. It was a reasonable assumption under normal circumstances. Diesel outweighed Sarah by more than £100 and had spent years in bar fights and prison yards learning how to hurt people efficiently. He never got the chance to apply those lessons. Sarah released Tank and spun in one fluid motion, her elbow connecting with Diesel's solar plexus with surgical precision. As he doubled over, gasping for air, her knee came up to meet his descending face. The impact echoed through the bar like a gunshot. Diesel hit the floor hard and didn't get up. The remaining Iron Wolves stared in disbelief. Their second-in-command, a man who'd hospitalized 3 people in a single fight just 6 months earlier, was unconscious before he'd even realized the fight had started. Tank struggled to his feet, his arm hanging at an awkward angle that suggested Sarah's grip had done more damage than initially apparent. His face was a mask of rage and humiliation, the kind of expression that preceded extreme violence. "Kill her," he snarled to his remaining crew. "Kill the crazy bitch right here, right now." The Iron Wolves moved as one, surrounding Sarah's table with the coordinated aggression of a pack that had done this before. Knives appeared, and at least 2 guns, their metallic gleam reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. Old Murphy fumbled for the phone behind the bar, his arthritis-gnarled fingers struggling with the buttons. "I'm calling the police," he shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. "Cops won't get here in time to scrape her off the floor." Viper laughed, his blade catching the light as he spun it between his fingers. "Should have just been friendly, sweetheart. Now it's too late for easy." Sarah stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor with deliberate precision. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked genuinely prepared for violence. Her stance shifted subtly, weight balanced, hands loose at her sides. "Last chance," she said, her voice carrying across the bar with absolute clarity. "Walk away." Tank spat blood onto the floor. "The only thing walking away is going to be us, stepping over your corpse." That's when the fight really began. Sarah moved like water, flowing between attacks that should have overwhelmed her through sheer numbers. Viper's knife thrust met empty air as she twisted away, her counterstrike breaking his wrist with an audible snap. The gun in his other hand clattered to the floor as he screamed. A second biker came at her from behind, only to find himself airborne, flying through space to crash into a table that exploded into splinters under his weight. A third tried to tackle her low, achieving nothing except a knee to the face that rearranged his features permanently. The fight was over in less than 30 seconds. 8 Iron Wolves lay scattered across Murphy's Tavern like broken toys, groaning or unconscious. Tank stood among the wreckage, his good arm hanging useless at his side, staring at a woman who appeared completely unruffled by the violence she'd just unleashed. "Impossible," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Nobody moves like that. Nobody's that fast." Sarah straightened her t-shirt, which had torn during the brief but intense combat. As she did, something became visible that made Tank's remaining colour drain from his face entirely. There, on her left shoulder, was a tattoo that every military man in America would recognize instantly. A golden eagle with outstretched wings, clutching arrows and an olive branch, surrounded by text too small to read from a distance. But Tank didn't need to read the text. He knew what it was. Delta Force, the most elite special operations unit in the United States military, the soldiers that other soldiers whispered about in tones of respect and fear. Old Murphy dropped his phone, the plastic clattering against the floor behind the bar. In 43 years of serving military personnel, he'd never seen that particular tattoo. He'd heard rumours, stories, legends about the men and women who wore it. But seeing it in person, especially on someone who'd just dismantled 12 armed bikers single-handedly, was like witnessing a myth come to life. "Sweet Jesus," he breathed, his voice barely audible. Tank took a step backward, then another, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. You're one of them, the ghost soldiers." Sarah said nothing, simply watching as the realization sank in. She'd hoped to avoid this revelation, but circumstances had forced her hand. The torn shirt was an accident, but perhaps a fortunate one. Sometimes the truth was more effective than continued deception. "We didn't know," Tank continued, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "If we'd known who you were—" "You'd have done exactly what you did," Sarah replied calmly, "because you saw a woman alone and assumed that made her vulnerable. The uniform doesn't change the person, Tank. It just reveals who they really are." Around the bar, the conscious Iron Wolves were helping their injured brothers to their feet, moving with the careful urgency of people who suddenly understood they were in the presence of something far more dangerous than they'd ever imagined. Viper cradled his broken wrist against his chest, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching respect. "We'll go," he said quietly. "Won't be any more trouble." "Yes, you will," Sarah agreed, "and you'll make sure word gets around. Murphy's Tavern is off limits to the Iron Wolves. Permanently." Tank nodded rapidly, eager to escape with what remained of his dignity and his life. "Done. You got our word." "Your word," Sarah repeated, and something in her tone suggested she placed little value on promises from men like Tank Morrison. "Here's mine. If I hear about the Iron Wolves causing problems for anyone in this town, anywhere in this county, I'll come find you. And next time, I won't be so gentle." The threat hung in the air with absolute credibility. These men had just witnessed what gentle looked like when a Delta Force operator decided to end a fight quickly and efficiently. None of them wanted to discover what she might do if genuinely motivated toward violence. "Understood," Tank said, backing toward the door. Completely understood. As the Iron Wolves gathered their wounded and headed for the exit, old Murphy finally found his voice again. "Miss," he called out, his words carrying across the suddenly quiet bar. "Your money's no good here. Ever. This place owes you more than I can ever repay." Sarah turned toward him, and for the first time all evening she smiled. It was a genuine expression, warm and human, completely at odds with the clinical efficiency she'd displayed moments before. "Just doing what anyone should do, Mr. Murphy," she said, "looking out for people who can't look out for themselves." "Not anyone," the old bartender replied, his eyes dropping to the golden eagle tattoo still visible on her shoulder. "Not everyone can do what you just did." As the sound of motorcycle engines faded into the distance, the bar slowly returned to something approaching normalcy. The few remaining patrons cautiously resumed their conversations, though their voices remained subdued and their eyes kept drifting to the woman in the corner who just redefined their understanding of what was possible. Sarah returned to her table, where her whiskey glass sat exactly where she'd left it. She took a slow sip, savouring the burn, and pulled out her phone to send a brief text message. Package secured. No complications. The response came almost immediately. Understood. Extraction in 300 hours. She deleted both messages and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Her real mission here was complete, though the evening's entertainment had provided an unexpected bonus. The Iron Wolves had been terrorizing this area for months, and local law enforcement had been unable to do much about it. Sometimes problems required solutions that operated outside official channels. Old Murphy approached her table carefully, carrying a fresh glass of whiskey. "On the house," he said, setting it down beside her original drink. "And if you don't mind me asking, are you here because of the Iron Wolves, or was that just luck?" Sarah considered the question, weighing how much truth she could safely share. "Let's call it a happy coincidence," she finally said. "I had business in the area. They provided entertainment." The old man chuckled, a sound that seemed to release the last of the tension from the evening's events. "Some entertainment. 43 years I've been running this place, and I ain't never seen anything like that." "Hopefully you'll never need to again," Sarah replied. Murphy nodded, then hesitated as if working up courage for another question. "That tattoo, how many people carry that mark?" "Not many," Sarah said simply. "And the ones who do, you'll probably never see them coming." As the evening wound down and the last few patrons settled their tabs, Sarah remained at her corner table, watching and waiting. Her extraction wouldn't come for several hours, and until then, she was content to maintain her cover as just another patron enjoying a quiet drink. But word of the night's events would spread quickly through the veteran community. Stories would be told, details would be embellished, and legends would grow. By morning, half the county would know that one of the army's most elite soldiers had been drinking in Murphy's Tavern, and that the Iron Wolves had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. For old Murphy, it would be the story of a lifetime, told to every customer who would listen. For the Iron Wolves, it would be a humiliation that redefined their understanding of predator and prey. And for Sarah Blackwood, it was just another night's work, protecting people who would never know her name or understand the sacrifices made on their behalf. Sometimes the best operations were the ones that never officially happened. The golden eagle on her shoulder caught the light one last time as she finished her whiskey and prepared to disappear back into the shadows where warriors like her belonged. Tomorrow, she would be someone else, somewhere else, carrying out missions that existed only in classified files and whispered conversations. But tonight, Murphy's Tavern was safe, and that was enough.